On the 22nd of July 2015, in the suburb of Terby, about 20 minutes drive from Rinkeby, a group of at least 4 individuals pulled a heist at Forex exchange, getting away with cash worth about $200,000. This was a major lick that everybody was soon talking about in the streets of Rinkeby. By the end of that day, word had spread that a 19-year-old guy called Izzy had allegedly been the main culprit behind the operation. However, there had originally been others involved in planning this robbery. One of these guys was a 16-year-old Mazla. But for whatever reason, Mazla was not invited to the heist itself, which led to him feeling betrayed by Izzy for carrying the robbery out without him. Mazla's friends were sharing his anger, namely Makalele, Musa, Shobra, and Talang. After the robbery that they were cut out of, they went to confront Izzy. They would end up meeting him near a subway station in Rinkeby, where things would soon escalate, eventually leading to the group taking Izzy to a nearby wooded area where one of them would end up shooting Izzy in the back while he was trying to escape through the woods. Izzy was able to stumble through the small forest, ending up in the suburb of Bromston, which is a middle-class neighbourhood. Just for reference, this is like an upmarket area which is worlds apart from the projects of Rinkeby. And it's here in this upmarket neighbourhood that Izzy would ultimately collapse in the yard of an older couple who would phone for help. Unfortunately, later that night, Izzy would pass away in the hospital.
En 19-årig man dog i natt efter vad vittnen uppfattat som en skottlossning i Västerort. Enligt Aftonbladet.se ska 3 skott ha avlossats i skogen mellan Rinkeby och Bromsten och 19-åringen ska ha träffats i ryggen. Polisen har inlett en förundersökning om mord.
And this event would cause the large group of childhood friends of all different ages to split into two. Those who stood with Mazla, who had been cut out of the robbery, and those on the inside, who had been closer to Izzy. Mazla's group of close friends, who called themselves 3MST, which included that core group of Makan aka Makalele, Musa, Shobra, and Talang. This is the group that would eventually be labelled the Death Patrol. Meanwhile, the friends of Izzy would eventually begin using the name Shotters for their rival crew. But these labels for these groups wouldn't become prominent until some years later. And in the immediate aftermath of the death of Izzy, people close to him would go on the warpath, vowing to get revenge. According to later reports, the murder of Izzy acted as a watershed moment in Rinkeby gang politics, where youths formerly concerned mainly of hustling and petty crime would begin commonly carrying guns and eventually even having to wear bulletproof vests. Reports would also tell that Mazla and his friends went into hiding following the shooting due to the police likely looking for them as persons of interest. Although it's not been known for sure who had ultimately been the one responsible for pulling the trigger and killing Izzy, Mazla would reportedly make a call to his mother soon after Izzy's death, telling her that he feared that people were after him and that they wanted him dead. And these fears turned out to be valid, because not even 48 hours later, Mazla and his friends were ambushed at a gas station in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, Mazla was shot in the head and later pronounced dead at hospital. The police and the Swedish media were quickly drawing a connection between both of these murders, and security camera footage from the scene would show 2 possible suspects running away from the gas station. The police would eventually find some compelling evidence pointing to Izzy's 2 older brothers as being involved in the murder, but they were eventually excluded from the investigation without ever being charged due to lack of evidence. In an act of reconciliation by the families and the broader Rinkeby community, both Izzy and Mazla were buried next to each other. But this post-murder gesture would do little to calm down the escalating situation between these former friends now at war. Meanwhile, Mazla's friends like Makalele, Musa, Shobra, and Talang were soon caught out of town in connection with another completely unrelated investigation. So for the time being, this crew was momentarily broken up, as many of those involved were sent to so-called special youth detention centres, since there are no youth prisons in Sweden. Now, this is because the government are apparently aiming to reduce the detrimental effects of time spent in prison by young people. Now, let's see how that turns out over the course of the rest of this story. But the sentences in these centres are relatively short, and already by the end of 2015, these gang comrades would all be reunited, and then they would continue to commit crimes, including robberies, home invasions, carjackings, and drug dealing. Now, eventually, all of those crimes would land these members in full-blown adult prisons, briefly lowering the temperature in the streets of Rinkeby. But soon, the war on those streets would heat up, and these gangs would pass the point of no return. By late 2016, while the infamous Death Patrol quartet had been locked up, Izzy's friends, who had begun calling themselves the Shotters, had started to take over the streets of Rinkeby. Also, musical artists from Rinkeby, who would eventually become associated with the Shotters, were also on the rise, but at this point, they were still largely staying impartial to the brewing feud in the streets. For example, Yasin's rap career was blowing up. Already in 2015, he had signed his first record deal and dropped his first official single, the self-titled track, Yasin. Then, in 2016, Yasin, together with Jafar Bin and other rappers from the Yoruba suburbs, created a rap collective called Ghetto Superstars, which began creating some significant buzz in the national scene. Besides Jafar and Yasin, the collective would also include rappers like Blizzy, Dree Low from Husby, Monty B, Elias Abbas from Rinkeby, as well as ZE from Tenster. Some of these guys like Drilo and ZE would end up becoming some of the biggest rappers in Sweden. Also in 2016, Yasin would release one of his most popular songs, a track with the title translating to My Hood, together with a music video directed by acclaimed director Saga Berlin, who has also directed the music video for the song Tabanya by another Rinkeby-based artist called Cherie. Now, both of these music videos provide an excellent window into the world of Rinkeby at this time, with high-quality on-the-ground and drone footage showcasing the brutalist architecture in these suburbs in all of its glory. For the first time, the music coming out of these areas was giving the world and the country a window into life in the suburbs. Jafar Bin, on the other hand, who still in 2015 was shouting out Shobra, one of the core members of Death Patrol, in his songs, would actually end up taking the Shotters' side in the beef in the years following the death of Izzy, and this taking of sides would also be reflected in his music, eventually landing him in hot water with the Death Patrol. But before the beef would escalate to the next level, during the summer and fall of 2016, Makalele, Musa, Shobra, and Talang had gotten free once again. However, they hadn't been seen in Rinkeby, as they had reportedly been banned from the area by Shotters members and were spending time in the city of Malmö instead, making contacts in the streets there. However, they still had allies in Rinkeby who acted as their eyes and ears back on their native block. But while that was going on, the Shotters, who had lost many of their members as a result of a number of arrests after a recent large robbery, put them at a disadvantage in the streets. On the evening of December the 2nd, an alleged member of the Shotters, called Indiana, along with his brother Smokey, were at a local cafe in Rinkeby, without realizing that a friend of their ops had eyes on them. Suddenly out of nowhere, an automatic machine gun would spray up the windows of the cafe, making people inside hit the floor and panic. Indiana and Smokey would react fast, running into the back of the cafe in an attempt to escape through a back door. Unfortunately, they would end up getting trapped in the wrong room. Unable to escape, the gunmen would rush into the cafe, shooting both brothers, leaving them dead on the spot. After this brazen double murder, the situation would turn tense, as many people gathered around, even acting hostile towards the police at the scene of the crime. Unsurprisingly, following this incident, the police would once again struggle to catch any of the suspects following the murders, partly due to witnesses of the event either being vague about who and what they had seen, or plainly uncooperative. I guess the no snitching rule applies in Sweden too. In reality, many of the locals likely knew very well just who had been behind this brutal attack, but many were scared to share any information with the authorities. A week later, these two murdered brothers were laid to rest in front of a large crowd and media presence.
Inte bara de vi begraver. Wallahi, låt oss begrava våra dåliga beteende också idag. Låt oss begrava vårat hat och vårat krig med varandra. De som vill hämnas, tror ni de här grabbarna, våra bröder, tror ni att de här behöver att någon hämnas för dem?
And at this point, the Swedish media were already reporting on how every 10th homicide in the country was linked to the suburbs of Järva. Unfortunately, despite the police not being able to catch anyone, in the streets, revenge would come swiftly. Only about 2 weeks after the double murder, Musa would check himself in at a hospital in Stockholm with gunshot wounds to his lower body. Fortunately, he had worn a bulletproof vest that had stopped shots hitting his upper body, likely saving his life. Police would later gather that he had been targeted at a parking garage in the suburbs of Hulsta, near Rinkeby, in the early morning hours. Once police arrived at the crime scene, Musa had already left for the hospital, but at the scene, they would find 2 AK-47s and a car full of bullet holes with at least 40 shell casings. Unfortunately, Musa had returned to Stockholm with one of their new friends from Malmö, a man named Atto, aka A2, who was connected to gang members in Malmö who would later be known as Los Suecos, or the Swedes, a crew of contract killers who murdered numerous people in Spain. Atto was also an alleged drug dealer with connections on both sides of the conflict in Rinkeby. Those connections would end up costing him his life, as later that day, Atto would allegedly end up meeting a guy called A from the Shotters' side to allegedly collect a debt owed to him by Indiana, who had just been killed. Security cameras would reportedly capture Atto walking with A and another guy to a wooded area when Atto was suddenly shot, after which A and the other man would continue walking as if nothing had happened, leaving Atto seriously injured on the ground. The next day, he would unfortunately pass away from his injuries, while the police would arrest A and his friend for questioning. But despite the police seemingly knowing exactly how these latest murders were a result of the death of Izzy in 2015, there was once again not enough evidence to charge A or anybody else, making this yet another unsolved case in a growing list of unsolved shootings in the city. Meanwhile, following Atto's death, the locals in Järva had had enough of the killing, and they would gather for a demonstration against the escalating violence. Sadly, this wouldn't make a difference, and it wouldn't take long from here for the bloodshed in the streets to begin spilling into the music.